The shovel struck the earth with a loud smack, shattering the stillness of the early morning. Michael stood by his mother's grave as the first rays of sunlight stretched long shadows over the cemetery. His hands shook, not because of the chilly air, but due to the storm of feelings inside him. For months, he'd been doubting everything. Her unexpected death, the hurried service, and the way his dad had kept his distance ever since. Something just wasn't right. "I need to get to the bottom of this," he whispered, gripping the shovel even tighter. His mom, Laura, had been the nicest person he ever knew. She hadn't just passed away. It felt like she was stolen from him. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but Michael refused to accept that. Laura was vibrant, full of energy, and then, in an instant, she was gone. The grave was new, the soil still soft. Michael worked relentlessly, his muscles burning with each dig. Sweat mixed with tears on his face, and he realized he was crying. He didn't care what people thought. He just needed answers. And then he saw the coffin. His heart raced as he paused, staring at the wooden box that had once held the woman who had nurtured and protected him. He remembered her warm smile and contagious laugh, the way she always encouraged him to trust his gut. "This is for you, Mom," he thought. Taking a deep breath, he pried open the coffin lid. The hinges groaned in the quiet cemetery, and there she was. Laura lay there, pale and still, just as she had appeared at the funeral. But something was off. Her hands were balled into fists. Her nails were broken and stained with blood, and her lips were slightly open, as if she had tried to cry out. Then Michael noticed faint scratches on the inside of the lid. A cold shock ran through him. His mother hadn't died of a heart attack. She had been buried alive. Michael staggered backwards, his legs giving out as he collapsed onto the damp grass. His chest heaved, his mind whirled, trying to process what he'd uncovered. His kind, loving mom had been buried alive. The marks on the lid, the blood on her nails, the tight fists, they all told the same horrifying story. She was awake when she was laid to rest. Tears streamed down his face as he crawled back to the coffin, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her cold hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he managed to choke out. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." Even through the grief, a burning determination ignited within him. This wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had deliberately ensured she was buried before her time, and Michael was resolved to find out who was responsible. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the police. The calm voice of the operator on the other end seemed unreal against the chaos in his head. "I need to report a crime," he said steadily despite the turmoil inside him. "My mom, she was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery right now. Please, you have to come." While waiting for the police to arrive, Michael's mind raced. Who could have done this? His dad, perhaps? The thought made his stomach churn. His father, Richard, had been distant since Laura's death. But could he really be capable of something so cruel? And what about the doctors who pronounced her dead? Were they involved, or had they simply been deceived? The distant wail of sirens snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. Michael wiped his tears and braced himself for what was coming next. The police would have questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. But one thing was clear. Someone had taken his mother from him, and he wouldn't rest until he found the truth. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights slicing through the soft morning light. Officers swarmed the grave, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as they surveyed the scene. Michael stood nearby with his arms wrapped tightly around himself, eyes locked on the coffin, feeling detached, as though he were watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Soon, Detective Walker, a no-nonsense woman with keen eyes, approached him. In a calm but probing tone, she asked, "Can you tell me why you decided to dig up the grave?" Michael took a shaky breath and replied, "She didn't just die. Everything felt wrong from the start. The rushed service, the way Dad has acted ever since. I needed to know the truth." She jotted down some notes and then asked, "And where is your father now?" "At home, I think," Michael answered quietly. "He doesn't really know what's going on." Detective Walker studied him for a moment before signaling an officer to bring his father in for questioning and to call the medical examiner immediately. "We need to confirm what happened," she said. As the officers dispersed, Michael felt a surge of anxiety. His dad would be furious when he learned what he'd done, but Michael no longer cared, not after what he discovered. Meanwhile, the forensic team carefully examined Laura's body, recording every detail. The marks on the coffin lid, the bloody nails, and the faint bruises on her wrists that all pointed to a struggle. When a medical examiner arrived, she confirmed what Michael already suspected. Laura had been alive when she was interred. Detective Walker returned to Michael, her face grave. This is now a homicide investigation. We'll need to talk to your father and anyone else involved in your mother's death. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm her? Michael hesitated. His dad had always been difficult, though never overtly violent. Still, there was something about the way he behaved after Laura died, something cold and calculating. And then there was his father's girlfriend, Nina. Michael had long suspected she was more than just a friend. I'm not sure, Michael admitted. My dad didn't seem upset about her passing at all. And Nina, she's been around a lot more lately. I just don't trust her. Detective Walker made a note. We'll look into that. In the meantime, I need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. This is going to be a long process. Are you ready? Michael glanced back at the coffin, his heart heavy, but his determination firm. I'm ready. I just want the truth. Later, Michael sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room at the police station, his hands clenched together. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. Detective Walker sat across from him, her eyes studying him as she flipped through her notes. Tell me more about your father, she said calmly. You mentioned he's been acting strange since your mother died. Can you explain? Michael took another deep breath to steady himself. He's always been a bit distant, but after Mom died, it was like he didn't care at all. He didn't cry at the service, didn't even seem sad. And then there's Nina. She's been around so much more since she passed. I think they're involved. Detective Walker raised an eyebrow. Involved how? Michael's jaw tightened. I've seen them together. They're not exactly trying to hide it, and Mom even mentioned that she had a feeling something was off, but she never confronted him. She didn't want to cause trouble. The detective scribbled something in her notebook. Do you think your father might have had a reason to hurt your mother? Michael hesitated. The idea that his dad could do something so terrible was hard to swallow, yet the evidence was there. I'm not sure. He's not usually violent, but he's always been controlling. Plus, he stood to gain a lot from her death. She had a life insurance policy, and the house was in her name. If she died, he'd get everything. Detective Walker leaned back, looking thoughtful. That sounds like a solid motive. We'll have to check his financial records. What about Nina? Do you suspect her involvement? Michael shrugged, frustration bubbling inside him. I don't know. She's always been nice to me, but there's just something off about her, like she's always putting on a show. Before the detective could reply, a knock came at the door. An officer entered and said, "We've brought your father in for questioning. He's in the next room." Michael's heart sank. He wasn't ready to face his dad. Not like this, but he knew he had no choice. This was about his mom, and he owed it to her to see it through. Detective Walker gave him a reassuring nod as she left the room, saying, "Stay here for now. We'll handle the questioning and call you if we need you." Michael slumped back into his chair, his thoughts racing. He thought of his mom, her kindness, her strength, and the way she always put others first. She didn't deserve any of this. No one did. In the next room, Detective Walker sat down with Richard, Michael's father. He looked calm, almost bored, as he leaned back. "What's this about?" he asked dismissively. "We're looking into your wife's death," Detective Walker replied steadily. "Your son has raised concerns that he thinks she might have been buried alive." Richard's face remained unchanged for a moment, but his eyes flickered ever so briefly, a detail that didn't escape Detective Walker. "That's ridiculous," he said coldly. "She died of a heart attack. The doctors confirmed it." Leaning forward, the detective's tone sharpened. "Then how do you explain the evidence your son found? Scratches on the coffin lid, bloody nails, signs of a struggle. These details can't be ignored." Richard's jaw tightened, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his cool demeanor. "I don't know what he's talking about. Ever since his mother died, he's been off, always blaming someone." After a long moment, Detective Walker slid a sheet of paper across the table, a copy of Laura's life insurance policy naming Richard as the sole beneficiary. "Care to explain this?" she asked. Richard's eyes narrowed, and he paused before sighing and leaning back, a smirk forming on his face. "You think you're clever, don't you? Fine, I'll tell you the truth, but you won't like it." His smirk sent a shiver down the detective's spine. "We're listening. Start talking." Crossing his arms, Richard said smugly, "Laura was a burden. Always so perfect, so kind, so selfless. I mean, like it's a bad thing. She was holding me back. I had big plans, and she was in the way." Detective Walker's eyes narrowed. "So you decided to kill her?" Richard laughed hollowly. "Kill her? I didn't actually kill her. She was already on her way out, a weak heart, just like her mother. All I did was speed things up." Michael, watching from behind a one-way mirror, felt his stomach twist as his father's words cut deep. He longed to burst in and demand answers, but he remained silent, his fists clenched in anger. Detective Walker kept her cool, though her tone grew sharper. "What do you mean by speed things up?" Richard shrugged, as if discussing nothing more than the weather. "I gave her something to help her sleep, maybe too much. She fell into a coma, and the doctors assumed she was dead. It was that simple. No one even suspected a thing." Michael's breath caught in his throat. His father had drugged his mom, knocked her into a coma, and then had her buried alive. The shock hit him like a punch, leaving him feeling sick, his vision blurring as tears welled up. Detective Walker, however, pressed on. "And what about Nina? Was she involved in this?" Richard's smirk widened. "Nina was the one who suggested it. She's a nurse, so she knew exactly what to use and how much to give. We were planning to start over once Laura was out of the picture." Michael's heart pounded as he realized that Nina, the woman he had always considered a close family friend, had helped his father kill his mother. The betrayal was almost unbearable. Detective Walker leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Do you understand that by admitting this, you're confessing to a serious crime? Conspiring to murder your wife isn't something you can just shrug off." Richard's smirk faltered for a moment. "I didn't murder her. She was already dying. I just helped things along." "That's still murder," the detective replied coldly. Standing up, she signaled the officers. "Richard Simmons, you're under arrest for the murder of Laura Simmons. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers cuffed him and led him away, Michael finally stepped forward. For a brief moment, his father's eyes met his, and Michael thought he saw a flash of regret or shame, but it disappeared almost immediately. "You know, son of mine," Richard spat as he was dragged away. Michael couldn't bring himself to answer. His mind swirled with anger, grief, and betrayal. Yet amidst the chaos, one thought shone through. His mom had finally been avenged. Detective Walker approached Michael, her tone softening slightly. "We need to bring Nina in for questioning, too. This case is strong, but your testimony will make it airtight." Michael nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for everything," as he left the station. Outside, the morning sun felt harsh against his skin, and the world seemed darker and colder than before. Yet, there was a tiny spark of hope. His mother's death wouldn't be in vain. The police acted fast. Within hours of Richard's confession, they were at Nina's apartment. When the door opened, Nina's perfectly styled hair and polished appearance faltered as she saw the officers. Her eyes darted to Michael, who stood a few steps behind them, his face pale but resolute. "Nina Carter," Detective Walker said firmly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." Nina's confident composure crumbled. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything." Michael stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You helped him. You gave him the drugs. You knew what he planned to do to my mom." For a moment, Nina's eyes widened in genuine shock. Then her face hardened, and she sneered. "Your mom was weak. She didn't deserve him. Richard and we were meant to be together. She was just in a way." Michael's fists clenched in anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're both monsters." As the officers handcuffed Nina and led her away, Detective Walker turned to Michael. "We need you to testify in court. This case is strong, but your statement will make it unbreakable." Michael nodded, even though the thought of facing his father and Nina in court made him feel sick. "I'll do whatever it takes." The trial moved quickly and mercilessly. Richard and Nina's confessions, along with the evidence from digging up Laura's grave, left no room for doubt. Both were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael sat in the courtroom, his emotions all over the place, relief mixed with bitterness. His mother was gone, and nothing could bring her back, but at least her killers had been held accountable. After the trial, Michael went back to the cemetery. Standing before his mother's grave, now marked with a fresh bouquet of flowers and bathed in the glow of the setting sun, he whispered, "It's over, Mom. They're gone. They can't hurt anyone else." He knelt down, placing a hand on the cold headstone. "I miss you every day, but I promise I'll make you proud." As he stood up, a gentle breeze brushed his face, carrying the faint scent of his mom's favorite perfume. For a brief moment, he felt her presence, warm and reassuring, as if she were right there beside him. Michael smiled through his tears and said, "I love you, Mom." Finally, for the first time in months, he felt a bit of peace. Though the road ahead would be long, he knew he wasn't alone. His mother's love would always guide and protect him as he walked away from the cemetery, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Michael took a deep breath, feeling some of the weight lift off his shoulders. He had faced the darkness and emerged a little stronger, and he knew that no matter what came next, he would be okay.